She threw the last of her pride into the dirt and knocked anyway. Her knuckles were split. Her boots had holes clean through the soles. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the storm rolling across the Wyoming plain didn't care one bit about any of that. Abigail Boone pressed her fist against that weathered door and hit it 3 times hard, because soft wouldn't save her tonight. When the door swung open and a tall, stone-faced rancher filled the frame with a lantern in one hand, and suspicion written across every line of his face, she didn't flinch. She looked straight at him and said the only thing she had left to offer. "If you let me stay tonight, I'll cook you supper. If you are watching this story right now, I want you to stay with me until the very end, because what happens between Abigail Boone and Jeremiah Stone is not a simple story. It is the kind of story that will stay with you." Before we go any further, I am asking you to subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let us go back to that porch. Let us go back to that door. Let us go back to the night everything changed. Summer had been brutal that year across Wyoming territory. The kind of brutal that cracked the earth and turned creek beds into dust and made men meaner than they had any right to be. Abigail Boone had been walking since before dawn, and she had nothing left in her body except the stubborn refusal to lie down in a ditch and give up. She was 34 years old. She was heavy-set with strong hands and a wide back built for work, and she had been told her whole life that a woman who looked the way she looked ought to be grateful for whatever scraps the world threw her direction. She had spent a long time believing that. She didn't believe it anymore. The canvas bag hanging off her shoulder held everything she owned in this world. A change of clothes worn nearly through, a small tin cup, a folded letter she hadn't been able to make herself throw away, even though every word in it had broken something inside her, and a short-bladed kitchen knife, not for protection, but because a woman who knew how to cook knew never to go anywhere without a decent blade. Stone Ridge Ranch sat at the end of a long, unpaved road, and she had followed it because she had no other direction left to follow. The ranch house itself was nothing grand. 2 stories built solid, but the paint was peeling, and the front porch railing had a split board nobody had bothered to fix. There were horses in the far paddock, 3 of them, and they lifted their heads when she came down the road, watching her. The way animals watched things they weren't sure about yet. She stopped at the porch steps and looked at that door for a long moment. Every instinct she had from years of hard living told her what was going to happen. The door would open. The man inside would take one look at her, and she would be told to move along. She had been told to move along from saloons, from church steps, from general store doorways, from the edge of town proper, on more occasions than she could count anymore. A woman her size traveling alone with no name, anybody recognized, and no husband to vouch for her existence, was not a woman most people wanted anywhere near their property. She climbed the steps anyway. She knocked anyway. And when the door opened, she found herself looking at Jeremiah Stone. He was taller than she expected. Lean through the shoulders, in the way of a man who worked hard and didn't think much about eating. Dark eyes, the kind that gave nothing away without deciding to. He had a week's worth of beard on his jaw and flour on his right sleeve, which told her he had been attempting to cook something and probably failing at it. The lantern he held threw yellow light across both of them, and he looked at her the way people always looked at her, starting at her size, moving to her dusty clothes, landing finally on her face with an expression she had catalogued 1,000 times. But he didn't slam the door. That alone was enough to make her keep talking. "I know what I look like," she said. "I know what you're thinking. I'm not asking for charity, and I'm not asking for your pity. I smelled something burning from halfway down your road, which means whatever you've got on that stove right now is ruined, and you're going to go to bed hungry unless someone saves it. I can cook. Properly. Give me 1 night under your roof and I will make you the best supper you've had in longer than you want to admit." Jeremiah Stone looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he looked past her at the empty road she'd come from the darkening sky, the dust beginning to move in curtains along the flat ground to the west. "Storm's coming," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who didn't use words unless he meant them. "I noticed," Abigail said. "You walked here from town, from past town. Something shifted in his expression just slightly. Not softness exactly, more like a recalibration. "What's past town worth walking away from?" "Nothing," she said. "That's why I left it." Another silence. The wind picked up. She felt the first grit of it against the back of her neck. "There's something burning," he said finally. "I know, I can smell it from here." He stepped aside. She walked through that door without letting herself exhale until she was fully inside, and even then, she kept her face steady, because showing relief was showing weakness, and she had learned a long time ago not to show anything she wasn't prepared to have used against her. The kitchen was a disaster. Not dirty exactly, but neglected in the specific way of a house where someone capable had been absent for a long time, and no one had quite figured out how to fill the space they left behind. There were pots stacked unevenly, a shelf bracket pulling loose from the wall on the left side. Flour tracked across the plank floor in a path that told the whole story of a man who didn't know where anything was in his own kitchen and had been too proud to admit it. On the stove, a cast-iron pan held what had once been intended as cornbread and was now a black disc that would have broken a tooth. Abigail set her bag down by the door, not in the way, and went straight to the stove. She pulled the pan off the heat with a folded cloth, set it on the stone hearth, and opened the back door to let the smoke out. "What else do you have?" she asked. Jeremiah leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Beef, some potatoes, onions. Salt. Yes. Butter." A pause. "Some. Dried herbs. There might be something in that tin on the second shelf. My wife kept—" He stopped. Abigail didn't turn around. She let the sentence end where it ended. "I'll find what I need," she said simply, and she got to work. She had cooked in ranch kitchens before, in boarding house kitchens in the back rooms of restaurants that didn't want her face out front where customers could see her. She knew how to work with whatever was available. She knew how to take a sparse pantry and make something from it that tasted like it came from somewhere better. Her hands moved without hesitation, finding the rhythm of it, and there was a specific comfort in that, in being somewhere she was useful in doing something she was genuinely good at after days of being neither. Jeremiah watched her for a while from the doorway. She could feel him watching, and she didn't mind it. Let him decide what he thought. She was going to cook his supper and sleep inside 4 walls tonight, and in the morning she would be gone before he woke up, and that was the whole of the plan. Except the storm hit before supper was finished. It came in fast, the way Wyoming storms did without negotiation, and the rain that followed was the kind that found every gap in every wall and made the world outside the windows completely invisible. They ate at the kitchen table by lamplight, the stew thick and seasoned properly for the first time in what she suspected had been a very long while, and Jeremiah Stone ate 2 bowls of it without saying much of anything. When he finally set down his spoon, he looked across the table at her with those flat dark eyes and said, "You can sleep in the back room. There's a cot." "I'll be gone by morning," Abigail said. "Storm won't be," he said. She looked out the black window. He was right. She could hear it beating against the siding. "One more night," she said. Not a request, a statement of terms. He nodded once and took his bowl to the wash basin, and that was the end of the conversation. She lay on that cot in the back room with the storm hammering the roof, and she thought about what came next. She had 7 cents in her dress pocket. She had no letter of reference anyone would trust. She had no family left in Wyoming, possibly no family left anywhere that would admit to knowing her. She had a name that had been printed in a Denver newspaper 3 years ago, in connection with a business scandal she had not caused, but had been unable to prove she hadn't caused. And that name followed her everywhere she tried to start over. She was 34 years old, and she was running out of places to go. In the morning, the storm was still going. She got up before dawn anyway and went to the kitchen and started coffee. Jeremiah came in an hour later and stopped when he saw her standing at the stove. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. He sat down without saying anything, and she poured him a cup and sat across from him with her own, and they drank it while the rain kept coming down. "You know how to repair things?" he asked eventually. She looked at him over her cup. "What kind of things?" Should need resetting. Books haven't been properly kept since March. He paused. Among other things, Abigail was quiet for a moment. She was doing the mathematics of it in her head the same way she always did. What was being offered? What was being left unsaid? What the actual cost would turn out to be, because there was always a cost, and the ones that looked generous at the start were usually the worst ones later. "What are you paying the hands?" she asked. "Don't have any. Last two quit in April." "Why?" His jaw tightened slightly. Place has been difficult to manage. She could read between that well enough. A man deep in grief running a property alone, probably not easy to work alongside. She didn't say any of that. "I'm not a charity case," she said instead. "If I work, I get paid. Room, board, and wages. Same as any hired hand." Something in Jeremiah Stone's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. More like respect, reluctant and unannounced. "Fair enough," he said. That was how Abigail Boone went from one night on a cot to a job at Stone Ridge Ranch. She fixed the shelf bracket that morning with a replacement dowel and wood glue she found in the supply shed. She reorganized the pantry so things were where they should be. She went through the account ledger on the small desk in the front room and found it in a state that made her press her lips together hard and say nothing, because saying something would have embarrassed him, and embarrassing the man who was paying her wages on day one was not a strategy that served anyone. Instead, she spent the afternoon untangling 3 months of incomplete entries, cross-referencing receipts he'd stuffed into the back of the ledger without recording, and building a picture of the ranch's actual financial position. It was not a good picture. Debt to the grain supplier. Overdue payments on a banknote. 2 unpaid invoices from a farrier who had stopped coming around, probably because he'd gotten tired of waiting. Stone Ridge was not collapsing, not yet, but it was leaning in that direction with nobody watching it closely enough to push it back. She was watching it closely now. When Jeremiah came in from the south fence at dusk, muddy to the knee and moving like a man whose back had been disagreeing with him for hours, she had supper ready and the ledger laid out with a clean summary page on top. He sat down. He ate. He looked at the ledger. He didn't say anything for a long time. "The farrier," he finally said, "needs to be paid before he'll come back. It's the smallest outstanding debt and the most urgent given the state of the mare's back left shoe, I noticed this afternoon." Jeremiah's eyes came up from the page. "You know horses. I know what a loose shoe looks like, and I know what happens to a horse that works on one too long." He looked at her steadily for a moment. There was something happening behind those dark eyes that she couldn't quite read yet, but she was beginning to get the sense that Jeremiah Stone was a man doing a great deal of thinking that he didn't put into words. "Where did you come from?" he asked. Not accusatory, just direct. Abigail held his gaze. "South of here. Before that, Denver. Before that, a few other places." "Running from something?" "Running towards something originally. Didn't work out the way I planned." She reached across and turned the ledger back to face him. "The grain supplier will extend credit for another 30 days if you go in person and speak to them directly. I'd recommend doing that before Thursday." He let her redirect him. She appreciated that. A man who could be redirected was a man worth working for. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that she hadn't felt anywhere in a long time. She was up before dawn kitchen, going coffee ready, before Jeremiah came downstairs. She worked through the morning on whatever the ranch needed. Mending equipment recording a section of fence line that had gone slack, working through the accounts, writing letters to suppliers in the careful, educated hand that had once made a powerful man's business run smoothly before that same powerful man had decided she was more useful as a scapegoat than an employee. She didn't think about that during the days. She was too busy. That was one of the gifts of work. It kept the thoughts from circling. What she noticed in those first 2 weeks was how quiet Jeremiah was in the mornings, and how slowly that quiet changed over the course of a day's work. By evening he talked more. Not much more, but enough that she could see the shape of who he was underneath the grief he was still carrying around like a stone in his chest. He had run cattle here for 12 years. He knew every corner of his land. He cared about it the way some men cared about churches, with a seriousness that had no good words attached to it. His wife had died 3 years ago. He had never said so directly, but she had pieced it together from the things he didn't say, from the second coffee cup that stayed on its hook, from the way he sometimes stopped in doorways, as if he was remembering something he wasn't going to share. She didn't ask. That wasn't her business. What was her business was making sure Stone Ridge stayed standing, and she put her whole self into that every single day. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. First, it was Mrs. Callahan at the dry goods, who made a point of mentioning loudly to the woman behind Abigail in line that it was very unusual for a respectable widowed rancher to take in a strange woman of no known background. Then it was the two men outside the feed store who went quiet in that particular way that meant they had been saying something they didn't want her to hear. Then it was the note that appeared wedged in the gap of Stone Ridge's front gate, unsigned, which suggested that certain members of the community had concerns about the arrangements at the ranch. Abigail read the note. She folded it. She put it in the stove. She did not mention it to Jeremiah. She had been the subject of other people's opinions before. It was a weight she knew how to carry. What she didn't know yet, what she was only beginning to suspect, was that something else was moving in the distance. Something she had thought she'd outrun. Something that had nothing to do with gossip and everything to do with the reason her name had ended up in a Denver newspaper 3 years ago, attached to words like fraud and conspiracy and accessory. She had not done what they said she did. But she had been in the room when it happened, and in the eyes of the law and the public, and every county that shared a telegraph line with Denver, that had been enough. She thought she had put enough miles between herself and that story to start over clean. She was about to find out that some stories followed a person no matter how far or fast they walked. But that night, she didn't know it yet. That night, she was standing on the porch of Stone Ridge Ranch after supper, listening to the last of the summer rain drip from the eaves, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was not afraid of tomorrow. That feeling, as it turned out, was not going to last. 3 weeks into her time at Stone Ridge, Abigail found the second ledger. It was tucked behind a loose board at the back of the supply closet wrapped in oilcloth, and it was not Jeremiah's handwriting inside it. She recognized that immediately, because she had been reading Jeremiah's handwriting every day for 3 weeks, and she knew the way he formed his sevens, and the way he left almost no space between words when he was writing quickly. This handwriting was different, smaller, more deliberate, and the numbers inside it told a story that made her stand very still in that closet for a long time before she moved again. She wrapped it back in the oilcloth. She put it exactly where she found it. She pressed the board back into place and walked out of that closet and went back to the kitchen and stood at the wash basin with her hands in cold water until her thinking settled. It wasn't her business. Whatever that ledger was, whatever it meant, it was not her business. She was a hired hand. She cooked and she kept accounts and she fixed what needed fixing, and she had no claim on the private history of this ranch or the man who owned it. She told herself that clearly and firmly, and then she went and made coffee and thought about it for the rest of the day anyway. That evening, Jeremiah came in from moving the cattle to the north pasture, and she put supper on the table and sat across from him and said, "There's a second ledger in the supply closet behind the backboard." He went completely still. Not the stillness of a man who didn't know what she was talking about. The stillness of a man who had been hoping she wouldn't find it. "I know," he said finally. "It's not your handwriting." "No." He picked up his fork, set it back down. "It was my wife's." Abigail waited. "She kept the real accounts," he said. "What's in the main ledger is what we showed the bank. What's in that one is what was actually happening." He looked up at her. Stone Ridge was in trouble before she died. Bad trouble. She'd been managing it in ways I didn't know about until after. Borrowing against the land to cover operating costs, paying off one debt with another, keeping the books separated so nobody could see the whole picture at once. His jaw worked. She was protecting me from knowing how bad it was. Abigail absorbed that. How much? He told her the number. She had been right that it was not good. She had not known it was quite that far from good. "Does the bank know?" she asked. "The bank knows what's in the main ledger. The rest of it?" He stopped. No. Jeremiah. She said his name directly for the first time, and he looked at her as if the sound of it surprised him. That's not a gap you can maintain forever. When it closes, it's going to close hard. I know that. Do you have a plan? He was quiet long enough that she had her answer. All right, she said. She pulled the main ledger toward her across the table. Then we build one. They sat at that table until past midnight. She asked questions, and he answered them, and somewhere in the middle of it, the conversation stopped being about numbers and became about the ranch itself, what it had been, what his wife had believed it could be, what Jeremiah himself still believed on the days when he could make himself believe anything. He talked about the north grazing land and the water access and the cattle line he had been trying to establish before everything went sideways. He talked about it the way men talked about things they had almost stopped hoping for carefully, like the hope itself was something that could break if he pressed on it wrong. Abigail listened. She did the figures in her head while he talked. She cross-referenced what she knew against what she was learning, and by the time the lamp was burning low, she had the shape of something that might actually work. The north grazing land, she said. If you ran a second cattle line off it and sold direct to the rail depot at Clearwater, instead of going through Hale's broker, you'd cut out the commission entirely. Jeremiah looked at her. Victor Hale's broker handles half the cattle sales in this county. I know. Nobody goes around him. He makes sure of it. I know that too. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not saying it's without risk. I'm saying it's the only move that actually changes the numbers. Something shifted in the way he was looking at her. That recalibration she had seen before, but deeper this time. How do you know about Hale's commission structure? Abigail held his gaze for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was long enough to decide what she was willing to say tonight, and what she was going to hold back until she understood better what she was dealing with. I've moved through enough of this territory to know how the business works, she said. That's all. He didn't push it. She was grateful for that, and uneasy about it at the same time, because a man who didn't push questions was either very trusting or very patient, and she had learned that patient men were sometimes the most dangerous kind. The next morning, she was up before him as usual, coffee on, and when he came downstairs, she had a written plan on the table beside his cup. 2 pages, organized by priority. Short-term stabilization. First, medium-term growth. Second, the Clearwater option laid out with projected figures on the 3rd section she'd drafted on a separate sheet. He read it while he drank his coffee. He didn't say anything for a long time. You wrote this morning, he asked. Last night mostly. Finished it this morning. You sleep at all? Some. He set the pages down and looked at her across the table with an expression she still didn't have a name for. Abigail. Who did you work for before you came here? The question landed exactly the way she had known it eventually would. Direct, quiet, and completely unavoidable. A man named Caldwell, she said, in Denver. He ran land acquisitions and cattle investment for a syndicate. She kept her voice flat and steady. I kept his books, managed his correspondence, handled client accounts. Caldwell, Jeremiah repeated. He said it carefully, like a man tasting something he thought he might have tasted before. James Caldwell. Her hands were still on the table. She made sure of that. Yes, the silence that followed was the particular kind that meant something was being rearranged inside a person's head. She let it happen. There was nothing she could say in the middle of it that would help. His operation collapsed, Jeremiah said. 3 years ago. There were fraud charges. Yes. Were you? I was named in the initial investigation, she said. I was not charged, because I had not done anything criminal. She paused. That distinction did not matter much to most people's opinion of me, including in every town between Denver and here. Jeremiah looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank from it and set it down and said, The Clearwater option. You think the depot manager would deal with us directly without going through a broker? Abigail blinked, just once. I think he would if the price was right and the volume was reliable. Then let's go talk to him. That was the morning she understood something important about Jeremiah Stone. He was not a man who made quick judgments, and he was not a man who changed them easily, but when he made one, he committed to it fully and without drama. He had decided something about her, and he was moving forward from that decision, and he was not going to keep revisiting it every time something made him uncertain. She had not met many people like that. She found it unsettling in the best possible way. The trip to Clearwater took most of a day. They rode together, which was in itself a thing the county would find remarkable and would discuss at length, but neither of them mentioned that. The depot manager was a practical man named Oakes, who was tired of being undersold by Hale's brokers and was interested enough in the conversation to invite them to sit down and talk numbers seriously. They rode back in the late afternoon, a preliminary agreement in Jeremiah's coat pocket, and the silence between them on that ride back was a different kind of silence than the ones they had shared before. It was the silence of two people who had done something together and were still feeling the shape of it. "Hale's going to hear about this," Jeremiah said as they came down the ranch road. "Probably by tomorrow. He won't like it." "No," she agreed. "He won't." Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. "You know more about Hale than you've said." It wasn't a question. She had known this conversation was coming the same way she had known about the Ledger question and the Caldwell question. Some things were just a matter of when, not whether. He was connected to Caldwell's syndicate, she said. Not directly. Through two intermediary investors. He stayed clean when Caldwell's operation went under. He was careful about that. She paused. Victor Hale is always careful. But you know where the connections are. Some of them. She looked ahead at the ranch house coming into view. "I kept very good records, Jeremiah. It was the one thing I did better than anyone else in that office. And when everything fell apart and they were looking for someone to blame, I made sure those records went somewhere safe before I left Denver." She felt him looking at her from the side. She didn't turn. "Where safe?" he asked. "Safe enough," she said. And that was all she said about it. What happened next moved fast. Within 4 days of the Clearwater trip, two things occurred in the same week. The first was that the grain supplier in town told Jeremiah with visible discomfort that he would no longer be able to extend credit to Stone Ridge Ranch. No explanation. Just the sudden end of an arrangement that had held for 7 years. The second was that Abigail went to the dry goods for flour and was told at the counter in front of 4 other customers by Mrs. Callahan herself that certain respectable establishments had to consider their reputation and would no longer be able to do business with Stone Ridge so long as current arrangements there remained what they were. Abigail paid for her flour. She said, "I understand," in a voice that gave nothing away. She picked up her parcel and walked out. She made it to the edge of the building before she stopped and stood with her back against the wall and breathed through it. Her face was hot. Her hands were not entirely steady. She had been humiliated in public before. She knew how to survive it. But knowing how to survive a thing and finding it easy were two entirely different matters, and she stood there against that wall for just a moment and let herself feel it, the flush of shame and fury, and something sadder underneath both, before she straightened up and walked to the horse and rode back to the ranch. Jeremiah was at the south fence when she got back. She tied the horse and went inside and put the flour away and started on supper, and she had almost talked herself into not saying anything about it when he came in and washed up and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him, plainly without softening it. His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes went very still and then very hard. "Callahan said that to you directly," he said. "In front of people. In front of 4 people, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll go into town tomorrow." "Jeremiah, I'll go into town," he said again. Not loudly, just with the kind of finality that didn't leave room for negotiation. She looked at him across the kitchen. "You go in there and make a scene on my behalf, and it gets worse, not better. For both of us. I'm not going to make a scene." His voice was level. "I'm going to do business." And if Callahan or anyone else has something to say about who works on my ranch, they can say it to my face instead of yours." She didn't have an answer for that. That wouldn't have sounded like she was refusing to let someone stand up for her, which was a different thing entirely from not needing it. She turned back to the stove. "Supper's in an hour," she said. "I'll be there," he said, and went back outside. He went to town the next morning. She didn't ask what happened when he came back. He didn't volunteer it. But 2 days later, the grain supplier sent a boy out to the ranch with a note saying that the credit arrangement had been reconsidered and would continue after all. She found the note on the kitchen table and read it and put it in the desk drawer with the other accounts correspondence and did not mention it. Some things didn't need to be mentioned. What she didn't know, what she was still 2 weeks from knowing, was that Victor Hale had heard about the Clearwater arrangement within 48 hours of it being made exactly as she had predicted, and that he had not simply registered his displeasure and moved on. He had done something she had not anticipated, which was to send a man she recognized to a town 40 miles east of Clearwater to start asking questions about a woman named Abigail Boone. The man's name was Driscoll. He had worked for Caldwell's syndicate in Denver. He had also worked in less official capacities for Victor Hale, and he was very good at finding things people had tried to put behind them. Abigail didn't know Driscoll was asking questions yet. She was still waking up before dawn, making coffee, working through the accounts, fixing what needed fixing, watching Stone Ridge slowly begin to right itself. She was still standing on the porch some evenings, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, and feeling cautiously like something in her life might actually be turning in a better direction. She was still allowing herself for the first time in 3 years to imagine staying somewhere longer than 1 season. She should have known better. She had always been better at running the numbers than reading her own luck. Driscoll arrived in Clearwater on a Thursday. By Friday, he had spoken to enough people to know exactly where Abigail Boone was living and working. By Saturday morning, his horse was on the road to Stone Ridge Ranch, and in his coat pocket was a letter from Victor Hale that contained a very specific request and a very specific threat, and Abigail Boone was standing at the kitchen stove making biscuits when she heard the hoofbeats coming down the ranch road, and looked out and saw him, and went completely still. Every plan she had built, every careful morning, every evening on that porch, every number in every ledger, all of it narrowed down to the sound of those hoofbeats and the cold understanding that her past had finally caught up to where her present was trying to be. She set down the biscuit cutter. She wiped her hands on her apron. She went to the door. Driscoll didn't dismount right away. That was the first thing she noticed. He sat on that horse at the edge of the yard and looked at her standing in the doorway and let the silence do its work the way a man does when he wants you to understand that he is in no hurry and you are not in a position to make him be. He had always done that. She remembered it from Denver. He had a talent for making people feel small before he'd said a single word. She didn't give him the satisfaction of stepping back inside. "Abigail Boone," he said finally. Not a question, a declaration, like he was reading her name off a wanted poster. "Driscoll," she said. He swung down from the horse, then unhurried and tied the reins to the fence post nearest the gate. He was a narrow man with pale eyes and the particular kind of smile that never reached anywhere above the mouth. He reached into his coat and produced a sealed envelope and held it out toward her. "Mr. Hale sends his regards," he said. She didn't move from the doorway. "You can tell Mr. Hale I'm not accepting correspondence. That's not really one of your options." He set the envelope on top of the fence post. "He knows you're here. He knows about the Clearwater arrangement. He knows about Stone Ridge's financial situation in considerably more detail than you might expect." He paused. "He wants the documents, Abigail, all of them. Whatever you kept when you left Denver. You hand those over and this whole situation goes quiet. Stone Ridge stays standing. You stay comfortable. Everybody moves forward." She had known this was what was in the envelope. She had known it from the moment she saw his face. Knowing it didn't make standing there in that doorway any easier. "And if I don't?" she said. Driscoll smiled the smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then Mr. Hale is going to have to take an interest in some irregularities. he's recently become aware of in Stone Ridge's banking arrangements, the kind of irregularities that tend to attract a foreclosure notice. He tilted his head slightly. You're good with numbers, Abigail. You always were. You do the math. She heard boots on the porch behind her before she could respond. Jeremiah stepped through the door and came to stand beside her, and he looked at Driscoll across the yard with the specific kind of attention that men who spent years in open country developed for things that didn't belong there. "This man bother you?" he said. Quietly. Directed at her, but audible to Driscoll. "He was just leaving," Abigail said. Driscoll looked at Jeremiah with the measuring expression of a man recalculating. "Mr. Stone," he said, "you might want to hear what I came to say before you decide how this goes." "I heard enough from the porch," Jeremiah said. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. "You've delivered your message. Pick up your horse and ride back the way you came." Driscoll stood still for a moment, that calculation going on behind his pale eyes. Then he untied the reins, swung back into the saddle, and looked down at both of them. 3 days, he said. That's what Mr. Hale is extending as a courtesy. After 3 days, he stops being courteous. He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness and turned the horse down the road. She watched him go until the road was empty. Then she went inside. She walked straight to the kitchen, put both hands flat on the table, and stood there with her head down, breathing through the thing that was moving through her chest. It was not quite fear and not quite fury, and it sat directly on top of the place where she kept everything she didn't let herself feel during the day. Jeremiah came in behind her. He didn't say anything immediately. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one near her right hand and sat down at the table and waited. She straightened up. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She told him everything. Not the edited version. Not the version she had given him before carefully measured just enough to answer the questions he'd asked. The whole of it. James Caldwell and the syndicate, and the years she had spent building that operation from a poorly organized mess into something that ran cleanly and produced real returns. How she had not known at first what the land acquisitions actually were. How she had started to understand it gradually in the way that uncomfortable truths made themselves known. A document that didn't match a transaction that had no legitimate paper trail. A name that appeared in the accounts connected to a land parcel she later saw listed in a county record under a different owner who had never agreed to sell. She told him about going to Caldwell, about being told with complete calm that she had misunderstood what she was looking at and ought to focus on the accounts she was paid to manage. She told him about the 3 months after that, when she had quietly carefully made copies of everything that mattered. Not to expose anyone. Not yet. Just because she had worked for enough powerful men to know that paper was the only protection a person without money or connections actually had. She told him about the day the whole structure collapsed, how fast it moved, how Caldwell and his primary partners had lawyers and prepared statements and a narrative in place within 24 hours that pointed investigators toward the woman who kept the books as the person who had obscured the fraud, rather than the men who had committed it. She told him about the newspaper article, about the months of investigation that eventually cleared her name on paper while doing nothing to repair it in practice. She told him where the documents were. Not precisely, but enough. When she finished, the coffee in both cups was cold, and Jeremiah had not moved from his chair. He was quiet for long enough that she began to feel the weight of it. "Say something," she said finally. "Whatever you're thinking. Just say it." "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that you've been carrying all of that since before you knocked on my door, and you kept working this ranch like none of it was sitting on your back." That was not what she had expected him to say. It cut through her defenses in a way she was not prepared for, and she had to look away for a moment. "Hale is going to follow through," she said, pulling herself back to the practical. "He's not a man who makes empty threats. If he's decided to move against Stone Ridge, the foreclosure notice is probably already drafted. He'll find a way to make the bank pressure legitimate enough to hold up, and he has the right people to do it." "What does he actually need from those documents?" Jeremiah asked. "Proof of the connection between his investment capital and Caldwell's fraudulent land purchases." Right now, Hale can claim he was a distant investor who didn't know what called specific instructions, specific amounts tied to specific parcels. She paused. If those documents surface in the right place, Victor Hale doesn't just lose business. He faces criminal charges. So he needs them destroyed, or in his possession, which amounts to the same thing. Jeremiah was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet this time. Thinking quiet, rather than absorbing quiet. She had learned the difference. "You're not giving them to him," he said. She looked at him. "Jeremiah, you've been running from this for 3 years," he said. "You ran because you didn't have anywhere to stand. You do now." He met her eyes directly. "You're not giving him anything." The force of it hit her somewhere she hadn't let anyone reach in a very long time. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table and said nothing for a moment. "This isn't your fight," she said. "I brought this here. I brought it to your ranch, to your name, to your—" "You brought me a working ranch," he said. 3 months ago, this place was 3 weeks from failing. Right now, the Clearwater line is bringing in real money, and the accounts are clean for the first time since Eleanor died. His voice tightened slightly on his wife's name, as it always did, but he kept going. "You think I'm going to let Victor Hale threaten that, because he's afraid of what you know. That's not how this works. He'll come after this banknote," she said. "He has the connections to do it. You could lose everything." "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." Jeremiah stood up from the table. "Who else knows about those documents? Anyone you trust." She thought about that carefully. "There's a land attorney in Cheyenne named Marsh. He's honest, which is unusual enough in that profession to be notable. He handled some of the original property filings that Caldwell's syndicate falsified. If anyone would know how to get those documents in front of the right authority quickly enough to matter, it's him." "How quickly can you reach him?" "Telegraph. If I send today, I can have a response by tomorrow morning." Jeremiah looked at the clock on the wall. "It's still early. I'll drive you to town." She stood. "Hale may already have someone watching the telegraph office." "Then we send from Clearwater." He was already moving toward the door. "Get your coat." She got her coat. They didn't talk much on the ride to Clearwater. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some situations had a gravity to them that made words feel frivolous. She was acutely aware, sitting beside him on that wagon seat, of everything at stake, and everything that had been quietly building between them over the past weeks. The morning coffee silences the late-night ledger work, the way he had gone to town after Callahan humiliated her, and never once mentioned what he'd said or done. She was aware of it, the way you were aware of something you had decided not to look at directly, because looking directly at it would require you to deal with it, and there was always something more urgent demanding attention. The telegraph office in Clearwater was run by a young man named Coop, who charged standard rates and asked no questions, which were the 2 qualities she needed most. She drafted the message to Marsh carefully, saying enough to establish urgency without saying anything that couldn't safely be read by someone else. She paid for the transmission, and they were back on the road within 20 minutes. The response came at noon the next day. She read it standing at the telegraph office window in Clearwater, Jeremiah beside her, and the words moved through her like cold water. Marsh had received her message. He was aware of the Hale connection to the Caldwell syndicate. He had been aware of it for some time. He had in fact been quietly building his own documentation of land fraud in 3 Wyoming counties for the past 18 months, but had been missing the one piece of evidence that would connect the financial orchestration to Hale directly. Her records were that piece. He wanted to meet, in person, in Cheyenne, within the week. Abigail folded the telegraph message and stood very still for a moment, and then she laughed. Not from happiness exactly, from the particular release of a pressure that had been building for 3 years, finally finding somewhere to go. Jeremiah looked at her. "Good news." "The kind of good news that comes with complications," she said, and she showed him the message. He read it again. He handed it back. "You've been carrying evidence that could bring down a criminal operation for 3 years," he said, "and the one man who could use it properly has been in Cheyenne the whole time." "The one man who could use it properly," she said. "Just found out I exist." They rode back to Stone Ridge, and she spent the afternoon thinking through every angle of it, while her hands did the routine work of the ranch automatically. Her mind kept snagging on Driscoll's 3-day timeline. If Hale had already started the foreclosure process, a meeting in Cheyenne, even if it went perfectly, might not move fast enough to stop it. She was still working through that when the second rider arrived at Stone Ridge that evening. Not Driscoll this time. A younger man she didn't recognize who rode hard down the ranch road and pulled up with his horse lathered and handed Jeremiah an envelope without dismounting and left again before either of them had time to ask a question. Jeremiah opened it. He read what was inside. His face went very flat in the way she had come to understand meant he was managing something that had gotten past his defenses. He handed her the paper without speaking. It was a formal notice from the First Territorial Bank of Wyoming. Due to irregularities identified in the account structure of Stone Ridge Ranch, the outstanding note on the property was being called in full. Payment was due within 30 days or foreclosure proceedings would commence. 30 days. She stood there with that paper in her hands and felt 3 months of work and hope and careful rebuilding pressed down against one single number. 30 days. She knew exactly what Stone Ridge's liquid position was. She had written it in the ledger herself just last week. They did not have what that note required. Not close. Hale hadn't waited for the 3 days to run out. He had moved the moment Driscoll got back on the road. She looked up at Jeremiah. He was watching her. "We're not waiting until next week for Cheyenne," she said. "No," he agreed. "I need to get to where those documents are. Tonight." Something crossed his face that she might in a different moment have taken more time to examine. A kind of resolve that went deeper than practical problem-solving. "Tell me where," he said. She had hidden the copies in a town 30 miles north with a woman named Ruth Greer, who ran a boarding house and who had done Abigail a kindness 3 years ago that she had never been in a position to repay. Ruth didn't know what was in the oilskin packet. She just knew Abigail had asked her to keep it safe and not speak of it to anyone. Abigail told Jeremiah about Ruth, about the town, about the packet. He was already walking toward the barn before she finished the sentence. "Saddle up," he said over his shoulder. "We ride in an hour." She stood in the yard for just a moment after he disappeared into the barn. The sun was going down behind the flat horizon of the Wyoming plain, painting everything in colors too beautiful for the situation she was standing in. And she thought about that very first night, the storm, the burned cornbread, the door she had almost not knocked on. She thought about how close she had come to walking past this road entirely. Then she went inside to get her coat and her knife, and the one thing Hale had not been able to take from her in 3 years of running the meticulous memory of every name, every figure, every falsified document she had ever had to file, stored in the one place nobody could search. Her own mind. She was ready in 40 minutes. They rode through the night. Jeremiah set the pace and didn't push the horses harder than the dark ground warranted, and Abigail rode beside him without complaint, even though the saddle was wrong for her and her back had started protesting an hour in. She had ridden through worse. She kept her mind on Ruth Greer and the oilskin packet and the 30-day number printed on that bank notice, and that kept everything else manageable. They didn't talk much. The kind of silence between them now was not the careful silence of two people who didn't know each other well enough to fill it. It was the silence of people who had said what needed saying and were now moving through what came next. Around midnight, Jeremiah said, "You ever think about going back to Denver after this is done?" She considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. "There's nothing in Denver for me anymore," she said. "There wasn't much before, if I'm honest. I was good at my work, and my work was everything I had. When the work got used against me, I didn't have much left to stand on." "You've got more to stand on than you think," he said. She didn't answer that. She looked at the road ahead and let it sit. They reached the town of Harlan's Creek before dawn. It was a small place, the kind that existed primarily because it sat on the route between somewhere and somewhere else, and people needed a place to stop. Ruth Greer's boarding house was on the main street, a two-story building that kept its lamps burning low through the night. Because Ruth had strong opinions about travelers arriving after dark, having somewhere to go, Abigail knocked. Ruth answered inside of a minute, which meant she hadn't been asleep, which meant either she always slept lightly or something had already made her uneasy. Ruth Greer was 60 years old and built like a woman who had survived everything the territory had thrown at her through sheer refusal to be knocked down. She took one look at Abigail, looked past her at Jeremiah on the steps, and stepped back to let them in. "I was wondering when you'd come," Ruth said. Abigail stopped. "What do you mean?" Ruth's expression was carefully neutral in the way of a person managing something they didn't want to show. "A man came through here 2 days ago, pale eyes, narrow, asked whether I'd had a woman by your description staying here." Driscoll. Abigail felt the cold move through her chest. "What did you tell him? That I run a boarding house and don't keep records on every face that comes through." Ruth paused. "But he looked around, Abigail. He was thorough about it." "Did he find anything?" Ruth looked at her steadily. "What I kept for you is where I kept it. Nobody but me knows where that is, and nobody got there." She moved toward the back of the house. "Come with me." The packet was behind a false panel in the wall of Ruth's storage room, exactly where it had been for 3 years. Abigail's hands were steady as she took it, but her chest was doing something complicated that she didn't have time to examine. She had not let herself think about these papers much over the past 3 years. Thinking about them meant thinking about everything attached to them. But here they were, real weight in her hands, real paper, real proof, and they suddenly felt less like a burden and more like a weapon. She unwrapped the oilskin at the table, while Ruth put coffee on and Jeremiah stood near the door with his arms crossed watching. Everything was there. Carbon copies of internal communications between Caldwell and Hale going back 5 years. Ledger pages showing the movement of Hale's investment capital into the fraudulent land purchases. Falsified deed records with the original signatures visible beneath the altered ones. A letter in Hale's own handwriting. And this was the piece she had known mattered most. The piece she had copied 3 times and hidden in 3 different ways, authorizing Caldwell to proceed with a specific set of acquisitions in Laramie County, using methods that were described in terms careful enough to be deniable and specific enough to be damning. She sorted through them quickly, confirming what was there, and then she wrapped them back up and looked across the table at Jeremiah. "We need to be in Cheyenne by tomorrow afternoon," she said. "Then we leave inside the hour," he said. "Soon as the horses have rested." Ruth set down 3 cups of coffee and sat at the table and looked at both of them with the direct gaze of a woman who had earned the right to say exactly what she thought. "You understand that if Hale finds out where you're going and why he's not going to sit and wait on a legal process." "I know," Abigail said. "He's got money and he's got people. You've got papers and—" Ruth looked at Jeremiah. "And apparently a rancher." "Apparently," Jeremiah said, and the ghost of something moved across his face that might have been humor under different circumstances. Ruth turned back to Abigail. "Is it enough?" Abigail looked at the oilskin packet on the table. "It has to be," she said. They rode south as the sun came up, changing their angle away from the main road after the first 10 miles, because Abigail had been thinking about Driscoll and the fact that Hale moved fast and Driscoll would have reported back by now. If Hale had already sent people toward Cheyenne to intercept the main road was where they would wait. She told Jeremiah this. He didn't question her reasoning. He just turned the horses east along a cattle trail that added 2 hours to the journey and kept them off the road where someone might be watching. They were 4 miles outside Cheyenne when the rider appeared behind them. Jeremiah saw him first. Just one rider, but coming at a pace that wasn't casual. He said Abigail's name quietly, and she turned and saw it too, and her stomach dropped. "Driscoll," she said. "Different horse. Can't see the face yet." They kept moving. The rider kept pace, not closing the gap, but not falling behind either. Watching. Jeremiah's hand moved to his side and then settled, and he said, "Don't stop. Don't change speed. Keep going straight." They rode like that for another mile, the rider behind them maintaining distance, and Abigail's mind was running through every option and finding most of them bad. Then the rider pulled up at a fence line and stopped, and she realized he had reached the boundary of whatever territory he'd been sent to cover. He sat there on his horse and watched them go and didn't follow. She breathed. "Hale's having the roads watched," she said. "Not just the main road." "Then we're nearly out of his reach," Jeremiah said. "Keep moving." Marsh's office was on a side street in Cheyenne, above a land surveying company, and the man himself was waiting. He was in his 50s, compact and careful-looking, with the manner of someone who had spent decades in a profession where precision mattered and carelessness had consequences. He stood when they came in and looked at the oilskin packet in Abigail's hands, and something changed in his expression, a focus coming in sharp and immediate. "Miss Boone," he said. "I'm glad you're here." "Attorney Marsh," she said. She put the packet on his desk. "Everything is there. Every communication, every ledger copy, every falsified deed I was able to document before I left Denver." He sat down and opened the packet with gloved hands carefully and began going through the pages with the methodical attention of a man who already knew what he was looking for. He didn't speak for 15 minutes. Jeremiah sat in the chair nearest the door. Abigail stood because she was too wound up to sit. When Marsh looked up, his expression had settled into something grave and certain. "The Laramie County deeds alone are enough to open a formal investigation," he said. "The letter is—" He paused. "The letter is extraordinary. Do you understand what this establishes?" "It establishes that Hale personally directed Caldwell to use his investment capital for fraudulent land acquisition," Abigail said, "which is what I've been saying for 3 years. It establishes that and more." Marsh leaned back. "I have affidavits from 4 landowners in Laramie County who were displaced from property that later appeared in Hale's cattle acquisition records. I have documentation of forged county signatures going back 7 years. What I have been missing is the financial thread that connects Hale's money to the mechanism." He tapped the letter. "This is that thread." He looked across the desk at both of them. "There will be a territorial hearing. It cannot be avoided now, and frankly it should not be. But I need you to understand when this goes public, Hale will know within hours. Whatever protection you have needs to be in place before this filing leaves this office." Abigail looked at Jeremiah. Jeremiah looked at Marsh. "How long to file?" Jeremiah asked. "If I work through today and tonight, I can have the formal complaint before the territorial court by morning." Marsh paused. "But Miss Boone will need to remain in Cheyenne. I need her available to provide testimony and to authenticate the documents. Hale's attorneys will challenge provenance immediately." "I'll stay," Abigail said. "And the ranch?" Marsh looked at Jeremiah. "The bank notice has a 30-day window," Abigail said before Jeremiah could answer. "If the hearing moves fast enough. If the territorial court accepts the complaint and issues an immediate hold on related financial proceedings, which I will argue for the foreclosure action against Stone Ridge, would be suspended pending the outcome." Marsh folded his hands. "It is not guaranteed, but it is the strongest argument available." The silence in that room had the particular density of people sitting with odds they couldn't improve by worrying about them. Then Jeremiah said, "File it." And that was the end of the deliberation. What followed was the longest night of Abigail's life, and she had had some long ones. Marsh worked. She worked alongside him, pulling specific documents on request, providing the context for transactions that the papers alone didn't explain, walking him through the accounting logic of how Hale's money had been laundered through Caldwell's legitimate business operations. Jeremiah went to arrange lodging and came back with food that neither of them ate much of, and then sat in the corner and stayed awake, in the quiet way that she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through difficult situations, present, steady, not in the way. Around 2 in the morning, Marsh set down his pen and looked across the desk at her. "You kept meticulous records," he said. "Under significant pressure in a hostile work environment, with no legal protection, and no guarantee anyone would ever look at them." "I didn't know if anyone ever would," she said. "Why did you do it?" She thought about that honestly. Because somebody had to know the truth, she said. Even if it was only me. Even if it never went anywhere. She paused. I was taught that records matter. That the numbers don't lie if you write them down correctly. I couldn't stop what was happening, but I could make sure somebody wrote it down correctly. Marsh looked at her for a moment. The investigation 3 years ago, the newspaper reports, the way your name was used. Yes, I want you to know that I am aware that was a deliberate and calculated act of deflection by Caldwell and his partners. I was aware of it at the time. I was not in a position to do anything about it. She absorbed that. The validation of it was not as uncomplicated as she would have expected. 3 years of carrying something, and now someone who could have mattered was saying he had known. She felt Jeremiah's eyes on her from across the room, and she kept her face steady and said, "You're in a position now." "Yes," Marsh said. "I am." The filing went before the territorial court at 8 the next morning. Marsh presented it himself. Abigail sat in the gallery with Jeremiah beside her and listened to her own name being spoken in a courtroom in the context of justice rather than accusation, and it was one of the stranger experiences of her life. The judge reviewed the complaint for 40 minutes and then issued 2 things: acceptance of the formal investigation into Victor Hale's land fraud operation, and a temporary suspension of all financial actions connected to entities named in the complaint pending the investigation's completion. Stone Ridge Ranch was named as a connected entity. The foreclosure action was suspended. 30 days became something else entirely. She sat with that for a moment after the judge finished speaking. The gallery was not full. It was early, and this was not yet public, but the men who were present understood what had just happened, and she could feel the understanding moving through the room. She had walked into this territory 3 months ago with everything she owned in one canvas bag and a name she'd spent 3 years trying to outrun. She was still sitting with the feeling of it when Marsh appeared beside her and said, "There will be a full hearing within 60 days. You will be required to testify. Hale's attorneys will make it unpleasant." "They can try," she said. "He may attempt other forms of pressure before then." "He's been attempting pressure since I knocked on a door in Wyoming," she said. "I'm still here." Marsh almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "you are." Outside on the courthouse steps, standing in the morning air with Cheyenne moving through its ordinary day around them, Jeremiah stood beside her and looked out at the street and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You did that." "We did that," she said. He shook his head just barely. "I stood in a room and watched. You did that." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression that had none of his usual careful distance in it, and she felt something shift in the space between them. A thing that had been building for weeks, slow and sure, the way real things built without announcement. She looked away first. Not from discomfort, from the need to manage herself carefully, because she was not a woman who let herself want things she hadn't yet verified were real. "We need to get back to the ranch," she said. "We do," he agreed. "The Clearwater cattle line needs checking, and the south fence posts I marked last week still need resetting." "They do," he said. "And somebody needs to send a telegraph to the grain supplier before he gets confused about the account status." "Abigail." His voice was quiet. She stopped. "We can talk about fence posts tomorrow." She looked at him again. He was still watching her with that open expression that she was not accustomed to receiving from anyone, and she understood in that moment that this was not something she was going to be able to redirect with practical concerns. He was patient, and he was stubborn, and he had made a decision somewhere in the last 12 hours that he was not going to keep at the distance he had been keeping. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Not an apology, just honesty, which was the only thing she had ever really been good at. "Neither do I," he said. "I haven't in a long time." He paused. "We figure it out the same way we figured out everything else." She thought about that kitchen 3 months ago. The burned cornbread. The door she had almost not knocked on. The man who had stepped aside instead of slamming it. One problem at a time, she said. One problem at a time, he agreed. They stood on those courthouse steps a moment longer, the morning sun working its way up over Cheyenne, and then they walked down together toward where the horses were tied and the road back to Stone Ridge Ranch and everything that still needed to be done. Behind them, inside that courthouse, a clerk was copying out the formal investigation notice that would be served on Victor Hale by end of day. By tonight, Hale would know that he had miscalculated. By tonight, Abigail Boone was no longer the one running. The ride back to Stone Ridge took most of the day, and Abigail spent it thinking about what came next, the way she always thought about things methodically, in order starting with what was certain and working outward toward what wasn't. What was certain: the investigation was filed. The foreclosure was suspended. The documents were in the hands of the one man in Wyoming territory, with both the legal standing and the motivation to use them correctly. Victor Hale had been outmaneuvered, and he knew it by now. What wasn't certain: Hale was still a wealthy and connected man who had not gotten where he was by accepting defeat quietly. 60 days until the hearing was 60 days in which things could still go wrong in ways she couldn't predict. The territorial court was honest, but honest courts could still be pressured, delayed, complicated. She had learned a long time ago not to celebrate before the thing was actually finished. Jeremiah rode beside her without pushing her to talk, which she appreciated. He had a gift for that, for knowing when silence was what a person needed, and providing it without making them feel abandoned in it. She had not known many people with that quality. She was beginning to understand how rare it was. They came down the Stone Ridge Road in the late afternoon, and the ranch looked different to her than it had when they left 2 days ago. Not in any way she could have named exactly. Same house, same fence, same horses in the paddock, lifting their heads as they came in. But something in her chest recognized it differently than it had at first, and she sat with that recognition carefully, the way she sat with things she wasn't ready to examine too directly. She unsaddled her horse and rubbed him down properly and checked his feet before she did anything else, and when she came out of the barn, Jeremiah was standing on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, which had become, without either of them deciding it, one of the fixed points of their days together. She took the cup. She sat on the porch step. He sat in the chair above her. "Hale is going to make noise before the hearing," she said. "He'll try to discredit the documents. He'll try to discredit me." "Let him try," Jeremiah said. "I'm serious. His attorneys are going to go through my history in Denver with a very fine comb, and they're going to present every unflattering detail they can find to the court. I know that. It might get uncomfortable for Stone Ridge by association." Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Abigail, I went to town and told Calvin Marsh at the feed store that if he had a problem doing business with Stone Ridge on account of you being here, he could find another rancher to supply. He found another position on the matter pretty quickly. I reckon I can handle whatever Hale's attorneys say in a courtroom." She looked up at him over her shoulder. "You never told me you did that." "Didn't need to be told. Needed to be done." She looked back at the road. The late afternoon light was doing things to the Wyoming plain that she still wasn't accustomed to even after 3 months. The scale of it, the way the sky went all the way to the ground in every direction. "I want to write to Ruth Greer," she said. "She took a risk keeping those papers. She deserves to know what happened." "Write to her tomorrow," he said. "Tonight, eat supper and sleep in a bed because you haven't done either properly in 2 days." She almost argued. She didn't. She made supper that night, proper supper, not the quick, practical meals they'd been managing on the road, and they ate at the kitchen table the way they always did. And the ordinary familiarity of it after everything the past 2 days had held made something in her chest loosen in a way she hadn't expected. She washed the dishes. He dried them, which he had started doing 3 weeks ago without comment, and had continued doing without comment, which was, she had come to understand how Jeremiah Stone made most of his decisions quietly, without announcement, simply by doing the thing and continuing to do it until it became part of how things were. "The south fence," she said, handing him a plate. "Tomorrow," he said. "The Clearwater ledger needs updating with the last 2 weeks of figures." "Tomorrow," he said. The grain account. Abigail. He set down the dish towel and turned to look at her directly, and she stopped because his expression had that quality it sometimes had where all the careful distance was simply gone and what was underneath it was fully visible. "Stop," he said, not harshly. "Just for tonight. Stop." She stood there with a wet cup in her hands and looked at him, and understood that he was not talking about the fence posts or the accounts. She set the cup down. "I don't know how to stop," she said. "I've been moving for 3 years. If I stop, I have to—" She paused. "I have to feel all of it." "I know," he said. "I didn't stop either. After Eleanor died, I worked this ranch like if I stopped moving it would bury me." He picked up the dish towel again, folded it, set it on the counter. It almost did anyway, just slower. She had never heard him say his wife's name in full like that with that particular weight and gentleness both at once. She understood what it cost him. "I'm sorry," she said. "About Eleanor." "I know," he said. "Thank you." They stood in that kitchen for a moment in the specific silence of two people who have moved past the point of pretending they are simply employer and hired hand and have not yet decided exactly what they are instead. Then Jeremiah said, "I'm not asking you to stop being who you are. I'm asking you to let this place be somewhere you can rest. You've earned that." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not easy to live alongside," she said. "I work too much. I talk about accounts at supper. I get up before dawn and I don't apologize for it. I have a history that is going to follow me into a territorial courtroom in 60 days and come out in public in ways neither of us can entirely predict. I know all of that," he said. "I'm not small," she said, and she meant it the way she always meant it. Not just her body, but her opinions, her presence, her refusal to diminish herself to fit into spaces that had been built for someone else. "I take up room." Jeremiah looked at her with an expression she was finally allowing herself to read accurately. "Good," he said simply. "This ranch has too much empty space in it." She pressed her lips together hard and looked at the window and breathed through the thing that was moving through her chest, which was not sadness and not quite happiness, but was the particular ache of someone who has been braced against the world for so long that kindness, when it finally arrives in the right form from the right direction, feels almost like pain before it feels like anything else. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking," he said, and went to bank the stove for the night. The 60 days moved both slowly and fast, the way significant time always did. Marsh filed 3 supplementary briefs before the hearing. 2 additional landowners from Laramie County came forward with their own accounts of property displacement after their cases appeared in the investigation notice. A former clerk from Caldwell's Denver office, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of legal protection before speaking, provided a sworn affidavit corroborating the financial connections Abigail's documents established. Hale's attorneys did exactly what she had predicted. They filed challenges to the provenance of the documents. They submitted a brief characterizing Abigail as a disgruntled former employee, with a history of instability referencing the Denver newspaper reports, with the specific intention of making her sound unreliable before she ever opened her mouth in court. They were thorough, and they were expensive, and they did their job well. It wasn't enough. She testified for 4 hours at the territorial hearing in Cheyenne. Hale's lead attorney cross-examined her for 2 of those hours with the methodical aggressiveness of a man who had broken witnesses before and expected to do so again. He questioned her memory, her motives, her character, her physical movements on specific dates 3 years past her relationship with Caldwell, her relationship with Stone Ridge Ranch, her relationship with Jeremiah Stone. She answered every question with the same flat precision she had once used to keep Caldwell's accounts. She did not get flustered. She did not get angry. She did not embellish, and she did not soften, and she did not give the attorney a single thread he could pull on that would unravel anything she had said. Jeremiah sat in the gallery for all 4 hours. She did not look at him while she was testifying. She didn't need to. She knew he was there the same way she knew the sun was up, not by looking directly at it, but by the quality of everything around her. When the hearing concluded and the judge retired to consider the evidence, Marsh came to where she was sitting and said quietly, "That was the finest testimony I have seen in 30 years of territorial law." "I just told the truth," she said. "Most people," he said, "find that considerably harder than you made it look." The judge issued his findings 12 days later. Victor Hale's land claims in Laramie County were invalidated. His cattle acquisition records were referred to the territorial prosecutor for criminal review. 3 of his business partners whose names had appeared in Abigail's documents in connection with specific fraudulent transactions were named in associated proceedings. The bank actions against Stone Ridge Ranch were formally dismissed, the original note restructured under terms that the ranch's current income, including the Clearwater line, which was performing better than the initial projections, could comfortably service. Hale himself was in a lawyer's office in Denver when the findings were delivered, and reportedly said nothing for a long time when he read them. Whatever he said after that was between him and his attorneys and the territorial prosecutor, who was already preparing charges. Abigail read the judge's findings at the kitchen table at Stone Ridge the morning they arrived by post with her second cup of coffee, going cold beside her because she forgot to drink it. She read every page carefully. She read the section that specifically addressed the initial fraud investigation in Denver, in which the judge's findings noted that the documentary evidence made clear that the misattribution of criminal conduct to certain administrative employees of the Caldwell operation had been deliberate, and that those individuals' names should be considered fully cleared in the context of this proceeding. Her name, in a legal finding, cleared, not just not charged, not just insufficient evidence, cleared, deliberately and on the record. She sat with that for a long time, long enough that Jeremiah came in from the morning barn work, poured his coffee, looked at her face and sat down across from her without saying anything. He waited. She pushed the findings across the table to him. She pointed to the relevant paragraph. He read it. He looked up at her. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she let him, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said that the silence wasn't already saying better. The summer that followed was the best Stone Ridge had seen in years. The Clearwater cattle line ran clean and profitable. 2 hired hands came on in July, good workers' men who had heard through the county network that Stone Ridge was a fair operation with a future worth betting on. The south fence got rebuilt properly. The barn roof, which had been a problem Jeremiah hadn't had the resources to address, got fixed before the fall rains. The accounts were current and organized and showed for the first time in the double ledger's honest history genuine margin. Ruth Greer came to visit in August and stayed a week and declared that Abigail looked like a different woman than the one who had knocked on her boarding house door in the dark 3 years ago, which Abigail accepted as the considerable compliment it was intended to be. The county, as counties did, had largely revised its opinion. Not all of it, and not all at once, opinion moved slowly in Wyoming territory, and some people held their positions the way they held their land, with a grip that had nothing to do with reason. But enough of it shifted that when Abigail went to town, now the silences were different. Mrs. Callahan still did not go out of her way to be warm, but she did not repeat the performance at the counter, and that was sufficient. Sufficient was what Abigail had always been prepared to work with. It was an evening in September, the heat finally breaking the first real suggestion of fall moving across the plain, when Jeremiah came to where she was sitting on the porch after supper, and sat in the chair beside her, rather than the chair across from her, and she registered the difference without turning her head. They sat like that for a while, watching the light go out of the sky the slow Wyoming way, and then he said, "I'd like you to stay." "I am staying," she said. "Permanently," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the full open expression that she had stopped trying to read carefully and had simply started accepting as what it was, honest, undefended, his. "You mean marry you," she said. "That's what I mean." She looked back at the plain. The last light was going purple at the edges of the sky, and the horses in the paddock were settling for the night, and somewhere on the south fence line, a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks did, regardless of what humans were deciding on their porches. She thought about a canvas bag and a split porch railing and burned cornbread. She thought about a second ledger and a telegraph and a pale-eyed man on a horse who had ridden all the way out here to remind her that some things followed you no matter how far you walked. She thought about a courtroom in Cheyenne and 12 days of waiting and a paragraph in a legal finding that had given her back her own name. She thought about what it meant to build something instead of just survive it. "I take up room," she said. Same words as before, but the tone was different now. "I know," he said. Same answer, with the same quiet certainty. "I'm going to keep the accounts the way I keep the accounts. I'd be worried if you didn't. I get up before dawn. I noticed. And I'm not going to pretend to be less than I am to make this easier for anyone. Abigail." His voice was steady and warm and sure. "I fell in love with who you are, not who you might be if you made yourself smaller." The word love, spoken plainly in that voice in that evening air, landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She let it. "All right," she said. He looked at her. All right, she said again, and she was smiling, which she didn't do often enough, and knew it, and he was smiling back in the rare, unguarded way he had, when something reached him past the grief he still carried and always would carry, and it was not a grand moment. There was no audience and no theater, just two people on a porch at the end of a working day, choosing each other with the same practical honesty they had brought to everything else since the night a storm rolled in and a woman with a worn canvas bag knocked on a door she almost hadn't knocked on. They were married in October in the yard of Stone Ridge Ranch with Ruth Greer and two neighboring ranchers and the men from the bunkhouse present, and the ceremony was short because neither of them was given to ceremony. And afterward, there was good food and the kind of plain celebration that working people made for themselves without pretension and without apology. Abigail Boone had walked onto this land with nothing but her hands and her mind, and the stubborn conviction that she was worth more than the worst thing anyone had ever said about her. She had been right. Some people spent their whole lives waiting to be rescued by the right circumstances or the right person. Abigail had never waited for rescue. She had knocked on a door. She had cooked a meal. She had fixed a shelf bracket and rebuilt an account ledger and ridden through the night and stood in a courtroom and told the truth until the truth was the loudest thing in the room. And in the end, what she had built with her own hands was the only home she had ever needed.